Hi, this is Dave from Miami Pest Control. A client at Southwest 104th Street having a vermin problem. If you wouldn't mind just swinging by and checking it out.
For more information, press 1.
If you've ever played Payday 2, you may have noticed this guy. I noticed this guy as he was the only character I had locked. In order to unlock him, I had to buy this little game called Hotline Miami 2, wrong number. So I bought it and didn't touch it for well over a year, until one day I decided that I'd give it a go. Boy, I wish I'd done it sooner.
This game scratches an itch I didn't know I had. I've never played any game like Hotline Miami, but this game managed to wriggle through my rigorous defenses and somehow end up on my screen. For those who don't know, Hotline Miami is a fast-paced top-down shooter based in a neon-soaked 1980s Miami, made by Denton Games and published by Devolver Digital. Denton is made up of two guys, Jonathan Soderstrom and Dennis Whedon, who are seen in-game as the two janitors. The two of them met whilst working on a promo game for Dennis's metal band. They worked on a few other games together like Life, Death Island, none of which were created to make money. But with bills stacking up and money running out, they decided their next game would be commercial. After sifting through Jonathan's catalogue of old, unfinished, incomplete games, they stumbled across Super Carnage. Whedon instantly saw its potential. As such, 9 months later, we had Hotline Miami. The gameplay is extremely fast moving, featuring a complicated yet enriched narrative, a roster of varying characters, a slapper of a soundtrack, and touches on topics that, while addressed by other media, are explored in a way that sets the game apart from the otherwise familiar treatment of these themes, covering violence, identity, and the blurred lines between heroism and villainy. On a quick side note, generally when I say Hotline Miami, I'm referring to both or either of the games. They're similar enough in gameplay and concept that I believe they can be referred to more as one singular experience. This means I may refer to levels or concepts from either game. Unlike anything I'd played prior, Hotline Miami was a breath of fresh air. Not to say it's a completely original game, but I usually enjoy a more open and less directed kind of game, something like GTA, Garry's Mod, Project Zomboid, Red Dead, and the like. So being reintroduced to more linear levels and gameplay was honestly great. The gameplay is typical of your average top-down shooter. Move with WASD and attack with your mouse. Whilst not being dissimilar from other games like it, Denton Games perfected those core fundamental mechanics, which built a strong foundation for the game's more interesting mechanic, the masks. Whilst you play as the same character for most of the first game, you're able to wear a variety of masks, each with distinct names and abilities, creating a level of replayability that so many games strive for. Similarly, in the second game, you play as multiple different characters, most of which have distinct abilities. The masks are the series' defining feature, being the most integral and recognizable part of the game. As you progress through the story, more masks become available, but not all of them. Some masks are hidden throughout the game, giving a reason for the player to properly explore the maps in the midst of their slaughter, whilst further adding to the replay value. Alongside masks, more weapons unlock, allowing for even more variety in gameplay. The game lends itself nicely to varying playstyles too. Whilst rewarding combos, thus a faster paced style, I found myself taking the levels slower than the average player, waiting for enemies to be in the perfect position for a near silent execution before moving on to the next. But the game can most definitely be played at the opposite end of the spectrum, going in guns blazing and rapidly clearing rooms before the enemy has a chance to react. One of the things I like most about the game is you're often forced to play in one of the two playstyles, giving you a good feel for both. Some levels have such a high density of enemies and long open corridors, making picking off enemies one by one far more difficult. Thus, whether you like it or not, you have to be thinking on your feet trying to kill multiple enemies at the same time, whereas other levels force a slower approach, with enemies holding long angles, making rushing far more difficult. The game also rewards variation in your playstyle, using different weapons, which encourages the player to switch away from the weapon type they're comfortable with. On my first playthrough, I found myself primarily using the ranged weapons, specifically the shotgun, but in my second, I found melee weapons to be far more prevalent in my style. The gameplay, like most games, is the core fundamental that holds Hotline Miami together. No amount of storytelling, sound design, or pretty graphics can conceal poor gameplay. But fortunately, Dennerton need not worry. The game Soderstrom designed all those years ago had the fundamentals. He had an understanding of what was required to make Hotline Miami the game he wanted it to be. Hotline Miami's gameplay is smooth, satisfying, but most importantly, fun. And what more could you want? Drugs on the rise, sports cars dotted up and down every street, neon lights on their resurgence, beautiful beaches, looming palm trees, a rise in pop culture and music. The state of Miami in the 80s. The vibrant, overwhelming colour and glow associated with that time is perfectly conveyed in the game. Each level radiating colour and design, the perfect backdrop for your mindless killing. According to Dennerton themselves, the game was heavily inspired by the movie Drive, drawing massively from the retro wave style, which largely came into popularity in the early 2000s, based on the 1980s vibe. Both games in their initial iterations had their neon cranked up to 11, but both Soderstrom and Whedon agreed to rein it in, especially in the second game, creating a slightly more grounded and realistic colour palette. The neon lit streets and their bold and vibrant colours serve a dual purpose. They create a visually striking world that pulls the player in, and they contribute to the game's disorientating atmosphere. The juxtaposition of bright pinks and electric blues contrasts with the red paint you spoil them with, as well as the dark subject matter of the narrative, emphasizing the game's themes of moral ambiguity and the blurred lines between right and wrong. At first glance, the pixel art of Hotline Miami may seem like a nostalgic throwback, but upon closer inspection, it reveals a meticulous attention to detail. The deliberate use of pixels isn't just a nod to gaming's past, it's a stylistic choice that heightens the impact of every brutal encounter. The limited resolution forces the player to fill in the gaps of their imagination, pushing the player's sick and twisted mind as far as it will go. Beyond its visual appeal, the art style of Hotline Miami plays a crucial role in conveying its narrative themes. The surreal and dreamlike quality of the environments mirror the fractured psyche of Jacket, contributing to the overall sense of unease. Ultimately, the art style of Hotline Miami isn't just about aesthetics. It's about immersing the player in a world that is as disconcerting as it is captivating. The deliberate choices in pixel art and color schemes aren't arbitrary. They're a calculated effort to elicit specific emotions from the player. As a result, the art style becomes an integral part of the gameplay experience.
No, brother. No! No, bro. No.
You restart a hell of a lot. This game is most definitely up there with one of the most difficult games I've ever played. Some levels taking me upwards of 30 minutes, nearing an hour to complete. Not to mention the smashed monitor, now keyless keyboard, and holes in my desk. I hate difficult things as much as the next guy, but I think Hotline Miami has difficulty nailed. The game is never unfair on the player. Each level is very much doable with patience, skill, and time. Whilst you may get frustrated at your inability to complete a stage, you never find yourself blaming the game, but instead yourself. Whilst you may find restarting levels over and over again discouraging in concept or initially in practice, you just don't realize how quickly you get back into the action and how rewarding the more difficult gameplay and inherent restarts makes completing the stage. I think dying so much in game is just a reminder at how utterly insane what you're actually doing is. Your character is essentially taking sometimes upwards of 100 enemies on at one time and not even getting slightly injured doing so. The experience is not supposed to be easy. You aren't a superhero. By the time you've restarted the level a dozen times, you end up clearing it John Wick-esque. You know exactly where everyone's going to be and when. The restart ends up feeling like less of a restart and more of a continuation of your previous run. Each life blends into one. Instead of your run feeling disjointed by your attempts, it ends up feeling like one single attempt. The game is challenging and its core fundamental concepts, but it's that challenge and those concepts that make the game what it is and what make it so addictive. Having replayed both games in order to write this script, I found them both substantially easier, completing both games in their entirety within under 5 hours compared to my first run of 15 to 20 hours. Initially, I felt as though that contradicted everything I'd said, but I actually think it goes to show the opposite. It shows that the games aren't unfair on the player. The difficulty comes from the fundamental mechanics which the player works to master. The games being generally easier did, however, make the times the games felt unfair stick out a lot more. Some levels are, to say poorly designed would be a disservice to their design, but poorly designed. On many different levels, enemies with ranged attacks are placed off screen, making getting killed by them pretty unfair and unfun. Whilst it's very possible to kill them, you just end up spending a lot of your time scanning right up to the edge of your screen, looking for an enemy that's waiting to snipe you. So as much as you hate the game more and more for being so difficult in each passing second, you'll eventually hit a point where you cross the threshold of required skill. That hate turns to passion, and that difficulty becomes finesse. Disjoint, incoherent, haphazard, directionless, fragmented, messy, confusing, perplexing, and ultimately unsatisfying is how I would have described the story the first time I played it. In the game's defense, unfortunately, I played the second game first, not realizing the series would have any semblance of a story. I figured the games were merely just killing sprees. This meant I had no context for any of the characters or the story going into the game. Thus, my initial understanding of the story was non-existent, resulting in me skipping dialogue and ultimately being completely underwhelmed with the story as a whole. That being said, I went on to play the original game and then extensively researched the story to gain a proper understanding of the masterpiece within the narrative of this game. Admittedly, my initial description of this game's story still isn't too far from the truth. Whilst once you've understood the story it is brilliant, it's in that process of understanding it that it falls a little short. That's not to discredit Denington's writing, but trying to keep track of the story solely through the game is tough. The first game is much simpler in narrative structure, following one single character for almost all the game and only switching after the credits for a few post-credit levels. The second game is where the story evolves or devolves depending on how you fared with the more complicated nature into a grander web of stories and characters. The biggest issue with the narrative of the second game is its disjointed and non-linear structure, forcing the player to keep track of dates and times in order to properly grasp an understanding. This isn't inherently a bad thing by any means. Now knowing the story, I can truly appreciate the brilliance of the non-linear structure, but but as a first-time player, it can be frustrating. You don't realize that you're supposed to be paying attention to the dates until it's too late. I found that by the time I realized I had been jumping through time, it was already too late and I was too deep into the story to properly understand it. The entire story of the series is a point of contention within the community, with many different interpretations and disagreements on how the story unfolds. So I'm going to be doing my best to give you what I've deemed the general consensus of the story. I won't be covering the entire plot in all its details, since it's simply too detailed and complicated for a video like this. So if you've played the games, you may notice some characters, some small details, and even maybe some story beats have been left out. The first game follows our protagonist, Jacket. He's an ex-military veteran from the Cold War. We open with a tutorial, after which Jacket is greeted by three masked figures, Don Juan, Richard, and Rasmus. Like many other things in the first game in particular, these figures go unexplained, instead being left up to the player to interpret. I take them to be some part of Jacket's psyche, each one representing a different part of his mind and personality. After this meeting, he is called and given his first job. He goes to a subway station where he steals a briefcase and kills Russians, which he later deposits in a dumpster, and then kills a homeless man. After several finishes, Jacket falls to his knees and vomits all over the floor. This section of the game continues on, repeating these calls and resultant jobs. On one of these jobs, Jacket rescues a captive girl who he takes home to his apartment. She's referred to as his girlfriend, implying that they have a relationship with each other. Between each of the levels, Jacket visits one of a few locations, namely a convenience store, a pizzeria, a bar, and a VHS store. Working in these establishments is the same bearded figure called Beard. Jacket and Beard appear to know each other, although we don't exactly know how. As such, Beard gives Jacket anything he wants on the house. At the start of the second part, Jacket visits the three masked figures again. As a part of their conversation, Richard asks Jacket 4 questions, one of which is, do you like hurting other people? This question goes on to be a staple quote from the game, summing up quite well what the game is really about. The players sense as killing and if they enjoy it. Part 2 continues to play out similarly to Part 1, Jacket partaking in more killing sprees, visits to the different locations, and conversing with Beard. The final level for Part 2 has Jacket arriving at Phone Home headquarters, the building we later find out is responsible for helping with routing of the calls. Upon entering, he finds all the employees murdered, and upstairs finds a man in a bike helmet. The biker turns to Jacket, and they begin fighting. Jacket barely manages to get the better of the biker before seemingly destroying the biker's head with a golf club. Now this is a part of the story which confuses most players, myself included. We later play this section again as the biker, and from the biker's perspective, Jacket is the one who meets his demise. But from Jacket's perspective, it is the biker. Lots of fans believe there is 2 alternative universes, but this theory is most likely incorrect given that both Jacket and biker appear in Hotline Miami 2 alive, meaning both of their versions are wrong or at least exaggerated. I'll come on to explain how this came to be. Jacket leaves the building and heads to the bar where Beard tells Jacket something terrible has happened tonight, adding, hasn't felt this way since San Francisco, hinting at Beard's currently unknown fate and foreshadowing Jacket's future. Part 3 finds Jacket attending yet another killing, afterwards visiting the store where he finds Beard and a corpse, the corpse of the biker, which swiftly disappears, hinting at the fact that the biker isn't truly dead. Part 4 starts with Jacket arriving home to find his girlfriend dead on the ground and a man named Richter sat on his sofa. Richter proceeds to shoot Jacket dead. Jacket finds himself in his apartment again, darker now. His girlfriend's still dead. He walks outside where he finds a hospital bed. He lays down in it before waking up in hospital. He's been in a coma. Now this is where some of the contention around the story comes from. There are a few different theories around how and when Jacket enters his coma, but here is mine. The game, up until Jacket wakes from his coma, is all fragments and disjointed memories of real, true events that happened before his coma. This explains all the weird and bizarre things he sees in and between levels, like why Beard is working in every shop and why corpses talk. When Jacket fought Biker, it was actually Biker's perspective that was most accurate, Jacket being left defeated but still alive. Jacket's perspective was merely a warped representation of what happened while he remembered it in his coma. He then continued his killings as per the phone's request. Richter, sent to kill Jacket after Jacket failed to kill Biker, arrives in Jacket's apartment, killing his girlfriend and then nearly killing Jacket, but instead putting him into a coma. This means that all the events seen in the game make logical sense. Some fans think that Biker put Jacket into his coma, but that leaves no room for Jacket and his girlfriend to get shot by Richter. And we know they were shot by Richter as he later confirms it. Jacket escapes from the hospital and returns home, collecting his clothes and mask in order to find and kill those calling him. He takes his now vandalized car and drives to the local precinct where he beats Richter and collects police evidence on the people leaving the phone calls. This evidence leads Jacket to believe that the phone calls are originating from the Russian mafia. As such, Jacket goes after them. This evidence, we later find out, wasn't entirely true, and Jacket missed out on the big picture by collecting the wrong number, thus, as some people believe, creating the name of the second game. Jacket kills the father of the mafia before going upstairs and killing the grandfather. He steps out onto the balcony, lights a cigarette, and throws a Polaroid off into the wind. It's assumed Jacket is then arrested as he is on trial in the second game. After the credits, we go back in time to May 13th, where we pick up again now playing as Biker, who has decided he wants out. We follow up his paper trail of clues in his attempt to take down those behind the phone calls. Along his journey, he ends up going to phone home, where Jacket arrives to stop him. Biker swiftly takes care of Jacket before leaving and continuing his mission. Eventually, he ends up finding those responsible, 2 janitors, who we've seen in Jacket's playthrough. Assuming the player solves the puzzle found in the pause menu, Biker will be able to look at their computer and find out about the organization responsible for the calls, 50 Blessings, an international organization angling to topple the Russia-American coalition. We'll come to learn about this coalition soon. He talks to the janitors, who aren't particularly helpful and rather vague in their answers before the player is given a choice to kill them. Biker leaves out the way he came and rides off into the desert on his motorbike. And that's the story of Hotline Miami 1. Now for the complicated part. Hotline Miami 2 follows multiple interwoven stories occurring at different time frames and also alongside each other. I'm going to talk through the game in chronological order in order to aid story cohesion. The game starts with Jacket and Beard's backstory. They knew each other from the Cold War, both fighting in an elite squad called the Ghost Wolves. The leader of this squad is called the Colonel. We see him lose his mind as the war progresses, eventually culminating in him skinning a panther and wearing its face as a mask. The final level sees the squad overtaking a power plant before it's put into self-destruct. Jacket and Beard manage to escape, while the rest of their squad is killed in the explosion. The fate of the Colonel is unknown. After getting to the evac helicopter, Beard hands Jacket a Polaroid of them, the same one Jacket throws away at the end of the first game. Jacket returns to Miami, and Beard returns to San Francisco, to which he soon meets his demise. San Francisco is nuked, most likely killing millions in the process, Beard included. From nuking San Fran, America is forced to surrender to Russia, where a new Russia-American coalition is formed. Radical American patriots are unhappy with this decision and start an organization known as 50 Blessings. During the events of Hotline Miami 1, 2 other people are in the same position as Jacket, Richter and Jake. Jake is very eager to do 50 Blessings' dirty work, even having suggestions of his own on what they could do. He is eventually sent to a Russian meth lab where he is killed. His body can be seen in the first game. Richter, the man responsible for killing Jacket's girlfriend, is arrested and put in prison, from which he escapes during a prison riot, now residing in Hawaii. During this time, the events of Hotline Miami 1 play out. Jacket gets all the calls, does the jobs, gets a girl, hallucinates Beard, loses the girl, enters a coma, leaves the coma, and topples the mafia. After Jacket's killings make the news, a movie is put into production about him, Midnight Animal. It shows a depiction of the events of the night Jacket saved the girl, but with a much darker twist. So dark, in fact, the game was banned in Australia, which is only very recently lifted on consoles. The scene depicts Jacket sexually assaulting the girl, which we as the player obviously know is not what happened. This scene brings to light how the rest of the world viewed Jacket and the events of the first game, clearly not understanding the situation. The actor playing Jacket is then one day accidentally killed by the actress playing the girl when she fires a loaded prop gun at him. The son, who is now head of the Russian mafia, wants to reclaim territory that has since been stolen from him by the Colombians. He, his henchmen, and some goons go and kill the Colombians. After the successful job, his henchman approaches him and says he wants out. The son isn't unreasonable and so offers a henchman one last job, then he'll let him go. The henchman carries out the job, being rewarded with a large bag of cash but also his freedom. He returns home, hides the money, and goes to sleep. He wakes up to find the money, his car, and his girlfriend all gone. It's around this time we're introduced to the fans, an eager group of veterans trying to get the attention of 50 Blessings by committing killings not dissimilar from Jacket. Corey, Tony, Alex, Ash, and Mark, each one of the members donning a different mask and all having different abilities. They go on a few killings before deciding to slaughter a drug den. In this den, they find the henchman, fried out of his mind in a feeble attempt to deal with his life which just fell apart. They brutally beat him to death before snagging his phone. Evan Wright, a journalist who is writing about Jacket, and his friend Manny Pardo, a cop turned serial killer investigating his own killings. Evan is following up leads, one of which leads him to Richter, to whom he calls. After their conversation, Evan buys a plane ticket for Richter's mother so they can live together in Hawaii, and also finds a note from his wife asking him to stop with the book and spend time with his family again. Manny Pardo keeps asking Evan to write about the Miami Mutilator, which is the name for his serial killer alter ego, as he wishes for his 5 seconds of fame. One evening, the son tries to call the henchman, but upon receiving no answer, takes far too many drugs and slips into a drug-induced mania. The fans, who currently have the henchman's phone, receive the call and go to the Sun. They arrive at the Sun's tower and split up, taking a floor each. Each fan seemingly successfully clearing out each floor before being killed by the drug-fueled Sun, who sees them as a strange, realistic, animalistic version of their respective masks. Alex and Ash get to the roof, unable to contact the others. The Sun arrives on the rooftop and clocks them both before stepping off the building and falling to his death. Manny Pardo arrives on the scene and finds Mark, who has survived the Sun and is surrendering himself to the police. Pardo doesn't want to let Mark have the time in the spotlight, so kills him, claiming it was self-defense. Later that night, Pardo has a nightmare. He finds himself at one of the Miami Mutilator crime scenes, one of his crime scenes. The walls collapse, it's a movie set. His wish for infamy realized. A movie set of his police station. His captain sits opposite him, claiming he knows the Miami Mutilator is Pardo. Attempting to flee, Pardo runs straight into police, who gun him down on the spot. He awakens, panicked and paranoid. A phone call from the station asking him to go in. He grabs his gun, barricades his door, and waits. Richter sits watching the TV before it is interrupted by an emergency broadcast stating the presidents of the United States and Russia have been killed by armed men led by a US Army general, assumed to be the colonel from the Ghost Squad in the Cold War. Richard appears next to Richter. They agree that the good times never last. Richter pondering as to whether anybody's onto him, but soon realizes that the situation is much worse. A nuclear blast obliterates them both. America is bombarded by multiple nuclear bombs, killing off any remaining living characters. We watch Manny Pardo panicked in his apartment, Evan and his family, the actress from Midnight Animal, and finally Jacket all get obliterated by the nuclear blasts. And that's just about everything. There's a lot of details I left out of the story, but as a general consensus, I think I've done a pretty good job. The game and its story touch on many different themes, as I've mentioned previously. Themes such as, but not limited to, violence, identity, drugs, mental health, PTSD, and the ambiguity of heroism and villainy. Obviously, violence is the most prevalent theme of the game, given that it's seen most visually. The violence is simultaneously mindless in execution, but mindful in its narrative intent, making the player question not only the actions of their character and whether what their character is doing is right, but also what they're doing, which brings the violence of the game out of the screen and transforms it into something of a meta-commentary on the nature of violence in video games. Richard asking Jacket, "Do you like hurting other people?" starts to feel as though it's passing through Jacket and is aimed more at the player. Do we like hurting other people? Well, no, of course not. But we just spent God knows how long ruthlessly exterminating people. And for what? For fun? The film Drive shares a similar exploration of similar themes and characters. This stoic, pseudo-emotionless, unnamed protagonist who commits horrific acts of violence. Alongside this life of crime, they try to balance a normal life. Both of them unexpectedly meet a girl who they fall in love with, before that life is quickly taken away from them in one way or another. The film, whilst not as violent as the game, is relatively violent given its big screen appearance. The game, however, far exceeds the violence of the film, in light of the fact that gratuitous violence is widely more acceptable in video game form. Both sit at the higher end of violent content, given their form of media, although the way they use and explore this violence is quite opposite. Hotline normalizes this violence, desensitizing the player to it, and allows them to get comfortable with their slaughter. Drive does the complete opposite, having very little truly graphic scenes throughout most of the film before suddenly detonating this head with a shotgun and impaling this throat with a curtain rail. Ryan is mostly unfazed by this violence, whilst the audience perturbed, showing his character is clearly used to it. This is quite the opposite in Hotline Miami. Upon finishing the first level, Jacket is the one who is most disturbed, the player maybe not even considering just how violent the game truly was. After killing the homeless man, we see Jacket throw up, which I initially took as a quite literal gut reaction from him, because he just killed an innocent person. Sure, he just rampaged a metro full of Russians, but he's at a point of not even seeing them as people. However, this doesn't entirely track with Jacket's character, given that he fought in the Cold War and would be well adjusted to this sort of violence. As such, it may be more likely to do with his PTSD from the Cold War. Having seen unthinkable acts during his service, Jacket most definitely suffers from PTSD, and so having murdered the Russians and then the homeless man, who is also a veteran, which can be seen from his Steam art card, would have probably triggered his PTSD and caused him to throw up. As a part of his PTSD, Jacket may have developed some form of DID, or dissociative identity disorder, which could be where his masks come from. Each mask representing a different identity or part of himself in order to help him cope. But they're all just theories. Game theories. Like the majority of everything in Hotline Miami, it's unconfirmed. We don't know if Jacket has PTSD, but we can assume it. We don't know why Jacket throws up, but we can guess. That's part of the reason the story of Hotline Miami is so great. It's pretty ambiguous in its meaning and sometimes in its narrative, leaving lots of room for player interpretation. Denton wanted the music to be something else for the game. They didn't want your typical video game soundtrack, they wanted something more. And something more is what they got. Shit slaps. The music from this game is most definitely up there with one of the best video game soundtracks of all time, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. Its soundtrack, alongside its masks being integral to the game's identity, the music blaring in your ears while you mindlessly slaughter floor after floor of goons, only driving your murderous madness further up the wall, through the roof, and then wherever the road you see to proceed. After partaking in the catastrophic loss of life that you, so enjoy, you're forced to tread back through your carnage. The once vicious music, now replaced by Crush, by El Huevo, previously Videodrome in the first game. The drastic change in music brings you back down to reality and out of your virtual slaughterhouse, making us, the players, realize what we've done, and that we enjoyed it. Many other games would smash cut to a score screen and congratulate you on doing a good job. But before your congrats, Hotline makes you question your own sanity. Did you enjoy killing all those people? Why did you enjoy it? What are you doing with your life? It further begs the question of whether video games do in fact make us violent. Were we always this violent? A silent rage building inside all of us, only displayed through this virtual slaughter? Or does this rage come from these experiences, desensitizing us to what is ultimately horrific acts of violence? Questions that I sure as hell can't answer, but something to think about, and something this game makes you think about. In my mind, this game functions similarly to that of a sitcom. You can start watching and binge the entire show all in one go, or once you've watched the show, you can drop back in on your favourite episodes. Similarly, in Hotline, once you finish the game, you can easily drop back in on your favourite levels And even better than a TV show, you can play it with a different mask, making for a fresh, unique experience. Another addition to the sequel was an inbuilt level editor, allowing for a feasibly infinite number of levels to be created. I don't think feasibly is quite right. Unfeasibly, that isn't feasible, but there's a lot of levels that can be made. As such, there's a workshop full of custom-made community levels, some of which function as entire campaigns, forming Hotline Miami into something of a game engine, allowing players to create entire stories within it. As I touched upon when discussing the gameplay, the masks add a huge amount of replay value, giving players a wide range of abilities to use when completing levels. Alongside the masks, the weapons enable players to replay levels in all sorts of different ways. Although the non-linear structure of the story can take away from the game in the first playthrough, it most definitely adds to the experience the second time around. Getting to replay the story with an understanding of each character's story beforehand makes the experience far more enjoyable. Watching the fans arrive at the Sun's tower, knowing their imminent demise, knowing the Sun is manically murdering everyone he sees, the fans included. In the actual game, the events of the tower are split up quite substantially. You play through most of the fans' story way before you really get into the Sun's, and so we raid the tower as the fans way before we kill the fans as the Sun, and so can only assume the fans die off screen and only much later find out what really happened. That's just one example of how the non-linear structure is so much better the second time round. It's like any story. Knowing the ending lets you pick up on all the small details and foreshadowing. It's excellent. Improvements. There are a few things I would change about the game, but I wouldn't actually implement these changes, as much as I wish they were different, I think they are definitely a part of the game's identity. Thus, the game would feel like it's missing something without them. The most obvious thing for me was the non-linear style. It's tough for me to properly speak to it, as I had a particularly tough time with the story, given that I played the second game first. But I feel as though the story would be better experienced if it occurred in chronological order. The Cold War flashbacks work fine. Not even fine, they work well. They're obvious, it's a big visual change, an obvious visual cue, and help change up the pacing of the game, keeping it fresh. However, the smaller time skips around 1991, jumping between the fans, the Sun, and their henchmen, make the game particularly confusing. The time jumps for Jake and Richter are both good enough. It's just when the stories are interwoven and rely on each other that the non-linear structure can begin to fall apart. But like I said, now knowing the story and having played the first game and properly understanding what is happening, I can appreciate its non-linear style. And although it's questionable, I don't think I would change it. The one thing I would change though is most definitely the poorly placed enemies, especially in the second game. Having enemies placed off screen is really unfun, especially ranged enemies, but even melee enemies. Being shot at or ran at by an enemy you couldn't see isn't great. Hotline Miami was and still is a one-of-a-kind experience in my opinion. Not to say it's the best experience I've ever had, but it is special. I had never and am still yet to ever experience a game like Hotline Miami, a truly unique game. Admittedly, my first experience with the game was far from perfect. Starting with the second was a big mistake, resulting in a complicated narrative and gameplay that was far too challenging. Having then played the first game and replayed the second, I can confirm that the issues with the game were of no fault but my own. The gameplay was challenging, but in the best way possible. Finding myself constantly restarting, but not frustrated at the game or feeling cheated by it, but instead frustrated at myself. This was only reinforced by playing the game again and finding it significantly easier, only further displaying that the game is merely a skill differential, not any inherent unfairness in the game design. Hotline Miami, a duology exploring an intricately woven story of broken characters in a broken world. The story is that of brilliance, simultaneously meaningful and meaningless, exploring dark themes through a roster of characters whose stories all ultimately end in tragedy, leaving the destroyed world in which they resided hollow and empty, their impact now vastly overshadowed by that of the nuclear events. Their existence would have been forgotten, and their actions for nothing, forcing the player to take a look inward on themselves, asking questions of themselves, questioning themselves, what they know and what they think they know about themselves and those around them. The innate violence that resides within all of us, a basic fundamental of human nature. Is it still with us, simmering beneath the surface? Was it ever there to begin with? We scoff at those who act on it whilst we portray a face of sanity, like thoughts not too dissimilar don't plague the rest of us. Do they? And if so, do experiences like Hotline Miami or a film like Drive only further to make that simmering violence begin to bubble? Or do they help let off steam? I don't know. But what I do know is that the duology of Hotline Miami games is a masterpiece.
Let you choke.